this series has been basically founded on this principle that people can believe they believe something that they may not actually believe. And when you think about that, I know that sounds so weird to say all that, but people can believe that they believe something that may not actually believe is true, right? You know, we believe things that, and I've always used the eating thing as just the easiest thing to see. We all believe that we should exercise and eat better, but most of us don't, and so that's sort of where we're at, and we can go through a lot of different examples. But that's the truth. And what we understand is that our beliefs, even if they're sincere, because there's a lot of people that have very sincere beliefs. And this is one of the deceptions of our current generation today, especially young people. They believe that if you're sincere, it doesn't matter if it's founded in reality. And that's the problem. If your belief isn't founded in reality, it's a delusion. Right? Do you guys get that? It's a delusion. So I can sit here and tell you that I'm the king of England all I want to, but it's a delusion because there's no reality to that basis. And so, but if you want to start paying tributes and taxes to me, that'd be okay too. But you guys are awake today? Come on, hang in there with me. It's going to be a long day if we don't. So, but and that's the honest truth. But here's what we said, and this is really the bottom line for this whole series. There's always one key thought that wraps all these together, is that following Jesus, and that's the whole idea. We call ourselves followers of Jesus, Christians, Christ followers. Following Jesus is what happens when our lives align, and that's tough. Our lives align with what we say we believe about him. Because here's the truth. Most of the people that say they're Christ followers, they don't live like Christ. They live like themselves. They live according to their own mind and their own thoughts. And that's where it's hard when we start looking at what Jesus really said and his actions, how he worked. They really are tough. And today, as we start off today, in fact, the title today is Helping the Helpless. Right away, even if you're not a Christian, if you're listening online or you're here today with us and you don't know Jesus Christ, maybe you've never started a relationship, but you're here just searching out for whatever reason, or maybe somebody said, come because I want to get you lunch or whatever. But if you're listening, I think every person, whether they're Christian or not, would say this about Christians or what they think Christians should be. They would say that Christians should help the helpless. I mean, I'm not going to ask for you to raise hands because I don't want anybody to, if you did disagree, but I think most everybody, even non-Christians, would say that. They would expect a Christian to help somebody. In fact, you go to that story of the Good Samaritan. What's so shocking about that story is the fact that the two religious people, the priest and the Levi, they don't. Right? Because we expect, and our world expects, Christians to do good things. Now, we don't expect people who don't follow Jesus to do good things all the time. Right? We don't expect people with a background anti-God, maybe an atheist or something like that. We don't always expect them to do good, which they're trying to put up that image these days. But we do expect Christ followers to help the helpless and really to help everybody. And that's sort of one of those things. And I have a question that, as we get into today, the question I have is it possible? And think this thing through before you just jump out and blurt out an answer. In fact, you don't need to blurt out an answer. Just answer it in your mind. Is it true or is it possible that you could take steps in your life, steps of faith, that actually would lead someone else to be changed by God? Maybe even a miracle to happen in their life. Is it possible? And as we sit back and we think about it, is it possible for me to do something by faith in my life to change somebody else miraculously? And the answer is yes. Mark chapter 2. Mark chapter 2 is where we're at. Mark chapter 2, I'm going to give you a story. We're just going to read straight through the first 12 verses in Mark chapter 2. Now, you remember, we're going to be in Matthew before it's over. But Mark chapter 2 is going to give us a story that we're going to look at that's going to highlight really what I want to talk about. And then we're going to go over and see what Jesus said about helping the helpless. So Mark chapter 2 begins in verse number 1. It says, a few days later, and that's just Mark's way of just moving time forward. A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that he had come home. Now, I want to stop here just for a second and make a comment. This is just for your information, just so you can note this in case somebody ever asks you about discrepancies in the Bible. Most people go, well, wait a minute. Wasn't Jesus born in Bethlehem? Isn't he from Bethlehem? Isn't Bethlehem his home? Yes. born in Bethlehem because his mom and dad were of the house and lineage of David. So he's born in Bethlehem, but he left Bethlehem because that's not where his mom and dad actually were living at the time. They were living in Galilee in a little town called Nazareth. And so eventually they get back to Nazareth, and that's where he grows up. That's where Jesus is from. Thus, he's called Jesus of Nazareth, okay? Why does they say he's coming home to Capernaum? Because he moved from Nazareth, which was a nothing town full of rebels, and it was a sort of disgusting area. It really was. The people actually there, to keep the Romans out, would throw their garbage everywhere. So it was really just not a good place to be from. And so it was considered that's the armpit of Galilee. Let's not go to Nazareth. That's why when you hear one of the disciples ask, can anything good come out of Nazareth? That's what he meant. So here we have this Nazareth, but Jesus moved his center of location when he was doing his ministry for 3.5 years to a place called Capernaum. And Capernaum was a much bigger town in Galilee, and it was more of a center of trade and commerce, had a lot more to it. And the majority of his disciples were actually from Capernaum. So their homes, their physical homes would have been there. So it made sense for him to have his household operation there, his ministry operation there. And so that's what it means in Mark chapter 2, verse 1. Verse number 2 goes on in this story. It says the crowd, they gathered in such large numbers that there was no room left. It almost reminds you of that whole inn, like when Jesus was born, no room in the inn. There's no room left for anybody else, not even outside the door. I mean, could you imagine that? That would be great. This is every preacher's dream, by the way, to have a church service that there's no room. There's no room, not even outside the door. I've done that before in Africa, never in America. Isn't that sad? In Africa, we built a church building in Mombasa, Kenya, which is very hot, very humid. It's on the coast of the Indian Ocean. And it's sort of a resort area, except for we were in the poor village area, very Muslim. And so we built this large church building for a church that was existing there. And churches in Africa don't have electricity. Most of them don't have electricity unless they're in a big city. And they don't have glass windows. They put rebar across the windows, keep people from jumping in and steal. So the building was a little bit bigger, longer than this one. And I don't know, probably 800-900 people stuffed in this little room. When I started preaching, give you an idea, there were kids at my feet. There were kids all the way behind me. It was so weird. There's people behind me, like sitting crisscross applesauce on the floor behind me the whole service, and they didn't move. But it was hot. It was hot. And because the windows are your only air force coming in, and the rebars were being hung on by all the people who wanted to get in that couldn't get in. And so, man, they were just hanging everywhere. And these pews, you know what's great about Africa? These pews, we could get like 5-6 people on a row, maybe 8 people on one of these pews. In Kenya, you could get 50 easily. I'm telling you, that's how they pack them in. They don't even put backs on their pews because they're going to sit both sides of it. And I'm telling you, it's just amazing. But that was probably the most packed out place I've ever preached in, hanging in the doors and the windows. That's what I picture here when I see this. Not even room at the door. And he preached the word to them. That's awesome. That's what Jesus came to do, to proclaim good tidings. Verse 3 goes on to say, some men, just anybody, doesn't really get specific on it, some men, bringing to him a paralyzed man. That man had a problem, could not walk. He was paralyzed. Doesn't give us any more information than that. So we don't know how long, what caused it, any of the circumstances. But he was paralyzed, couldn't help himself. He was carried by 4 of them. Now, I don't know if you've ever carried a person. The only thing I can really think about when you get to carrying a person, now how heavy a person is, because this is a pretty heavy thing, is I've been a pallbearer before. And some of you men have been pallbearers. Usually at a funeral, they get at least 6 guys to carry a body in a casket. And the caskets are heavy and all that. But I tell you, I've lifted some pretty heavy caskets from time to time. Carrying a body is not something that's light and easy to do. 24 years ago, I was hurt in a basketball accident outside. I was playing outside down in Florida on a court, and I crushed my ankle, like nothing left. And I was in extreme pain. And the guys I was playing with, we were playing the church had an outdoor court. I lived on church property just across the court. And these guys didn't know what to do, and they were all a lot smaller than me. And so they started dragging me. Like, they thought, get them to the house and I think they were going to drop me off with my wife and say, okay, see ya. And so they're dragging me. And about that time they're dragging me across this court, along came a deputy sheriff car driving down, and he's just doing his normal patrol. And I noticed, like, he looked over, just drove, and then he stopped, and I saw the reverse lights came on, and he started backing up, and he pulled in. He goes, guys, what exactly is going on here? Because it's strange when you're carrying, there's 3 guys pulling on this one guy, because they could not pick me up, because I was a big guy. That's the beginning of the story. You can hear that story some other time. But that's really, these guys are carrying somebody. That's a heavy load to do. They took it upon themselves. They're carrying him because they realize he needs to get to Jesus. Verse number 4 goes on to say, since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, that's the obstacle. There was a problem. They wanted to get him to Jesus, but they couldn't because of the crowd. They made an opening in the roof. Now, that is so crazy for us because we're like, hey, I know of a youth pastor down in Florida that his church was going through a remodel, and he preached on this text, and he got the contractors to actually, while he's preaching, to cut through the ceiling and drop a guy down, and he acted it out and all that, and it was cool, and then he had to find another job. I don't know if that guy ever got a job, but he had to find another job. So anyway, it goes on to say they made an opening in the roof, and as they above Jesus by digging through it. Now the roofs there were thatched dirt roofs, and it was common for people to be on your roof. So that's not uncommon. In fact, most of the time you slept on top of the roof because it was so hot inside the building, and you might have goats and other things inside your house if you lived in this town. So they dug through the roof, and they lowered this mat that he was lying on, this paralyzed man. Verse 5 goes on to say, when Jesus saw their faith. Now, that's important. You might want to circle that, highlight it, or whatever, underline it. They didn't see the faith of the man who's paralyzed. Jesus saw the faith of the 4 who carried him. He said to the paralyzed man, your sins are forgiven. And that seems like, son, your sins are forgiven. That seems like an easy thing to say, and that's at least the doubters what they'd say. Verse 6, it goes on to say, now some of the teachers of the law, notice they were sitting there. Not active, they're sitting there. They're comfortable, they weren't active at all. Sitting there, thinking to themselves, this is what they thought, why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Now, when they say he's blaspheming, they mean he's blaspheming because he's attributing the abilities of God to forgive sins to himself. And who is he? We look at him and he's just a guy. We know he's he's Jesus from Nazareth. He's Joseph's son, he's Mary's son. He must be blaspheming because he's calling himself the Son of God, but Jesus knew who he was. Verse 8 goes on and says, immediately, Jesus knew in his spirit that this is what they were thinking in their hearts, and that's the problem. Jesus didn't know that. So we go on. He said to them, why are you thinking these things? And that's a fair question. Why are we thinking, this guy, he's willing to forgive his sins, he's willing to do the extra thing. Why are we thinking bad things? That's what Jesus is answering. So it goes on, verse 9, which is easier, this is Jesus' answer, which is easier to say to the paralyzed man, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up, take your mat and walk. Now, the question there is that conflict. If I go up to you and go, hey, your sins are forgiven, can anybody tell? Not immediately. You should be down the road, you should. But if I heal you and you were paralyzed and all of a sudden I say, get up, take up your mat and walk, and you do that, then hey, physical proof, we know it. But he knows deep down inside, which is the bigger deal? Forgiving someone's sins or just healing their bodies? Well, forgiving their sins, obviously, because that's the eternal thing. And so that's what he's saying here. He's giving them this consideration. So he goes on in verse number 10, and he says, hey, but I want you to know that the Son of Man, and that's a title that you'd have to go back to the book of Daniel. Daniel gives in prophecy, and it's Jesus' favorite title to use. It gives him both the attributes of God and man in a balance, and that's why he loved it so much. But he calls himself the Son of Man more than any other title. He says, I want you to know that the Son of Man, both God and man, has the authority on earth to forgive sins. So he looks at the man, and he doesn't just say what he's going to say. He's going to put some action. Verse number 11 says, I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home. And I love that because he's not willing to risk just, hey, I'm just going to say what I have to say. I'm going to show you the action, so get up and do it. And here's the reaction, verse 12. He got up, the paralyzed man got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of them all. Full view of them all. And this is their reaction. How do they react? This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, we have never seen anything like this. And that would be so cool, because if that happened here today, first of all, somebody would be upset about the roof, but it would be amazing, because we haven't seen anything like this. Jesus is showing the power to forgive sins is what they're talking about, not just the healing, but the healing's pretty amazing too. But when I think about this, the question I asked as we started, is it possible for you to take steps of faith to cause a miracle of God in somebody else's life? Absolutely, because it happened here in Mark chapter 2, right? See, it was the faith of these 4 men, their expectation, their actions, their willingness not to quit, and trigger the miracle in the life of this man who's paralyzed, because this paralyzed man really didn't do anything other than be luggage. He was just laying there. And I think today when we talk about this subject of helping the helpless, that's the idea. We know that we're all supposed to help, but are we? Because these 4 men did what nobody else was doing, and that's what I want to point out today. And I think there's a pattern that we can see in these 4 guys. At least I noticed this in this text here. 5 things we can see. In fact, if you like acronyms, we're going to spell out the word RAISE here. If you're taking notes, RAISE, I've got a phrase with each letter of what these men did to raise the faith in order to see a man with a miracle from God. And realize this, I want to make sure we didn't see these guys make a miracle happen. God made the miracle happen. But their faith in God changed everything. So the R, what's the R? Raise your expectations. I think the first thing that you have to realize with these men is that they raised their expectations, right? What impresses God? That's a question we should ask. What would impress God? And this story answers it, because in chapter 2, verse 5, Jesus saw their faith. I pointed that out already. Jesus saw the faith of those 4 men, and it raised their expectations, because what you have to understand, what he says when he saw their faith, is they knew their friend was paralyzed. If you had a friend who was really sick, paralyzed, or whatever, cancer or whatever, you may not expect them to get better. But these 4 guys did. Because they were willing. How do you know that? Because their faith caused them, first of all, to carry a heavy guy to Jesus. And then they're going to lift him up on top of the roof, and then they're going to cut a hole in the roof, and they're going to lower him back down. Do you know what all the problems that could have happened during that time period? I was just thinking the logistics of how that could happen. How embarrassing that would have been. This would have been me. If I had been one of the guys raising him up on the roof, about the time I got the roof open, I would have looked down and realized that Jesus had already gone on to the next town. That's how it happens for me. These guys took that risk. They also took the risk of having to repay whoever's house it was to have it rebuilt. I mean, that's another problem. But they were willing to risk that because their expectations was that God was going to do a miracle here. And that's the whole idea. See, their faith was the faith that led to the triggering of a miracle of Jesus Christ. And that's the whole idea. And get this, and I didn't put this down in the notes, but it's worth your thinking here. You will never raise people to higher levels until you raise your faith and your expectations. And I think that's the problem we have. Why is it that we don't see more things happen in church? Because we come in expecting the same old, same old. Same song, second verse, could be better, bet it's worse. Isn't that how we come in? Let me get in my same spot, sing the same songs, pray the same prayers, read the same Bible, hear the same preacher, just change text, that's all we're doing, and go home the same. When was the last time you raised your expectations? See, if you raise your expectations, you may see someone walk out of here who was paralyzed by sin, who was paralyzed by the deceptions of the devil. That's what I'm saying. These 4 guys, they came into this and they said, you know what? The expectations we have aren't the same as the crowd. The crowd, they marveled at everything. We are going to raise our expectations. I think the first step of our faith to see a miracle of God happen in our life for someone else might be just to raise our expectations. The A in raise would be this, to anticipate obstacles. Now, can you imagine these 4 guys, they come in carrying this man, and he's heavy. Don't think he's not. And he's laying on his mat, and I don't know what exactly that entailed, but he's laying on his mat, and they're carrying him, and I don't know, he may have just been a few hundred feet away, but it may have been miles. I mean, it may have been miles. This guy may have lived somewhere else. It doesn't say exactly where he's from. It doesn't give us a distance. But they anticipate the obstacles. Because for most of us, to be honest with you, If you were even bold enough to carry a friend to Jesus, the first time we saw the crowd packed out, blocking the door, we would have looked over at the guy and said, hey, buddy, sorry, it's not your day. You're just going to have to live paralyzed. There's nothing I can do. That's just the truth. That's how we live our Christianity today. These guys anticipated obstacles because obviously they came with the tools to remove the roof. Have you ever thought about that one? They came ready to tear up a roof. Hey, unless you're Randall, I heard Randall can do some pretty good demolition on houses and things like that, even burn them down. But unless you're really prepared like that, man, they anticipated obstacles. And when the obstacles were there, they didn't get all upset. They didn't become cynical. They didn't blame the people who were in their way. They didn't tell their friends, sorry, buddy, can't help you now. It's just too hard. They didn't let the obstacles derail them. They didn't let them discourage them. They didn't lose their faith. It didn't derail them. They raised the level of their anticipation by anticipating the obstacles they would face in their life. See, effective people don't stop when they run into obstacles. Did you get that? Effective people don't stop when they run into obstacles. You've heard it probably said this way: when the going gets tough, the tough get going. That's another way to say it. Yeah, it is. I didn't want to just say the old ways to do it. But the problem is, though, and this is our problem, in our thinking in 21st century Christianity, we assume that God is not working when we don't experience instant success. See, we live in the age of instant. That's the truth. Hell, God must not be in it because we didn't have 1,000 people show up. God didn't show up, and we just say, hey, God wasn't in it, and that's the easy excuse. And you know what? We didn't anticipate obstacles. Sometimes it's because we didn't define the win either. You ask the leadership that I meet with monthly, I always talk to them about defining the wins. Back last October, when we did the Halloween thing with my wife, I sat her down and said, what's the win? Because what if you only have 5 kids show up? Is it a loss? No, because it's not what you can't control. You can't control those things. Anticipate the obstacles and let's move forward. And these guys, they saw a crowd in their way, but they didn't let the crowd be in their way. They said, let's rise above that and let's take them up another notch, which brings us to the I. The I stands for increased contact. Increased contact. Here's the thought on that one. There is no impact without contact. That's a good one there. There is no impact without contact. You know what the problem in our society is today? American society is moving to a contactless society. Social media. If you've got more likes and more friends on social media than you do in real day-to-day life, there's a problem. I remember years ago reading I heard this pastor speak. He was at a conference down in Orlando. He grew up in Harlem in the projects. And growing up in the projects of Harlem, it's so different than what we deal with here. You live in an apartment that is very small. You have a front door, and then you have an iron gate that swings and locks in front of your door so nobody can break it in, because people would. That's it. You don't own a car. You don't have a parking lot. You don't have a driveway. You don't have a garage. None of those things matter because nobody has any money, so you walk everywhere. Ride public transportation. You might, if you have some money, might have a bicycle. But that's pretty much silly too, because you don't want to ride a bicycle in New York City. That's crazy. But what he said was his dream was to get out of the projects one day. His mom and dad saved his money and all of his life, and he went off to college, got his degree, and became a pastor. And he pastored out in the Pacific Northwest. And he was so excited that when his wife and child, they got this nice church going that he went to, they helped him buy a house. And his first house, he had not a 1-car, not a 2-car, but a 3-car garage. He was moving on up. That's what George Jefferson would tell him, right? He was moving on up. He said he remembered the first time he drove into his 3-car garage, and he looked over as he pushed the button to his remote on his garage door opener to open the garage. He drove in and sort of waved halfway to his neighbor who was also going in and out of his garage. And he pulled in, he stopped, and he clicked the remote to lower the door. He thought, what have I done? God called me as a pastor to reach people, and now I'm letting garage doors stand in the way of reaching people because I've realized I've isolated myself I'm looking to do things. And he realized in his own, and this was his own words, he acknowledged how that his working in church work was based upon people. It really was. And here he was doing things that kept him from people in his own neighborhood. He never met his neighbors because he liked the whole drive in the garage, wave a little bit, and that's about all he knew. And he felt like God would, and that's really where our society has led us to. 21st century, we had this problem with it. But Jesus, what did Jesus do? Jesus always connected with real people in real situations. And what was funny is he especially connected to the people that he wasn't supposed to connect to. See, people who are nothing like Jesus, and that's the whole idea there. So what we have to remember, these four guys, in order to move forward in their faith and to work the miracle for this man who's paralyzed, when they see the crowd, what do they have to do? They have to increase their contact. What does that mean? Hey, if you didn't know, to get up on the roof, there was one of two ways that they would get up on the roof. Either a ladder, which they didn't go down to the hardware store and buy one of those nice industrial ones. There was a makeshift ladder, or if they had fancy steps, maybe. Most of the time it was ladders. They got to lift a guy on a mat up to the top of that. That means you're going to be increasing your contact. Somebody's putting them on their back, their shoulder, or something. They're having to figure out something. And I think that's the whole point we want to make. In order to create the miracles around here, hey, if we're going to reach Seagrove, you know what we have to do, church? We have to increase the contact. Because without contact, there is no impact. That's what we have to do. That's how we help the helpless. See, to have impact, you have to increase the contact. Which leads us to the S. The S in raise is start lifting people up instead of putting people down. That's been the downfall of Christianity lately, hasn't it? See, everybody knows what Christians are against. Nobody knows what they're for. Got a text in the last couple weeks from a guy who said, hey, we need to get out there and we need to walk around these people and we need to sort of protest these people who are doing this thing that's ungodly. It is ungodly. I grant that. I remember talking to my wife. I said, I just don't understand why we have this mentality of protest. Why don't we, if we want to change people, people aren't going to change because we're protesting them, are they? They're going to change because we go down and give them some water. It always reminds me of the story Andy Stanley tells. When he first started out as a youth pastor working for his dad, Charles Stanley down at First Baptist of Atlanta, they had Pride Week coming through. And he knew that the people of his church, being older in their thinking and were very hostile towards the LGBTQ, whatever letters else they got on there now. So they came together as a staff and they sat down and they said, we need to do something because the parade's going to come right in front of the church. Right in front of the church. So we need to figure out a plan because we're afraid that our people in our church are going to be combatant towards those people, and we don't want to get on the news because our people and the people walking we're going to have clash. So he tells in the story how it was his week to preach, actually. His dad had appointed him to preach. And so they had come up with a plan to start church a little earlier, get out a little earlier. They had it timed out perfectly. And they had asked the people, they were pretty plain with the people of the church. Hey, we want you to park in the back, and we're going to have you go out the rear entrance so you won't see the front, in case there's a few early attenders. We're going to try and keep you away and get you out and get you out in record time. So everything was working on time. He preached the sermon, got done early. Everything was working fine. They rushed everybody out the back of the church. And he said he was standing there watching as he thought everything was going well until he noticed that all the people in his church went to their cars, put down their Bibles, reached in their cars, and pulled out signs that said things like, death to gays, burn in hell. And they used words that I wouldn't use in church or anywhere else, actually. And they walked out to the front exactly where we didn't want them, and they stood there in front of his church, First Baptist Atlanta, protesting the very parade. And sure enough, they were there. But what Andy Stanley tells in the story, it's even more shocking and really broke his heart even more, is as he watched what was going down, trying to be, he went out there really to be a buffer too, to make sure none of his people did anything physically to be dumb. But what really broke his heart was when he looked across the street at the other church across the street. I don't remember if they were Anglican or Episcopalian, but he looked across and they had signs too. But they also had a table, and on their table they had cold bottles of water. And their signs said different things. Their signs said things like, God loves you and so do we. Have some water on us. And Andy said he never felt so ashamed of his church and his people because they were putting people down rather than lifting up. You know, God loves us, even when we're sinners. Christ died for us. You aren't any good either. And how would you like it if someone came to your house and started picketing your sins? See, we're okay picketing the sins of big famous things, but if God said, hey, I want some people to go down and picket your house, how would you feel? You might think it's funny, but it wouldn't be funny, would it? It would be embarrassing. I'm not saying we should defend their lifestyle. What I'm saying is we should love people the way Jesus and God love people. And that's what these 4 guys did. They realized this paralyzed man, he's nothing. You have to start lifting him up. If we just keep putting him down, he's never going to go anywhere because the only person who can heal him is Jesus Christ. And if we want the miracle of faith to happen in somebody's life, you got to start lifting people up instead of putting people down. We're not here to criticize. We're not here to condemn. That's not what people need. We are called by Jesus to love people. Love God with all of our heart and all of our soul and all of our mind. And love other people just like we love ourselves, because we love ourselves more than anybody. The E in raise is to expect God to work. Expect God to work. See, God, and this is a shocking statement here, God is more ready to work in the lives of people than we think he is. At the end of this, in verse number 12, and I already told you this, in verse number 12, I made note of the fact that it said that this amazed everyone. I think there were 4 people, though, that weren't amazed. See, the 4 guys who did the work, who lifted them up, who increased the contact, who raised the level of their expectations, who lifted them up instead of put them down, I think they realized they expected. When they took this man to Jesus, they didn't expect Jesus to go, move on. No, they expected Jesus to work. And I think, once again, how would our lives look different if we came into church every week and said, God, work. Work. Did you come to church today expecting God to work in your life? Or did you just come today to hear a good sermon? You may be disappointed in that one. Did you just come because it's a social thing to do, because you were trained to do it as a kid? Or did you come expecting God to work in your life? See, the other thing is, I think sometimes we come in and we expect God to work in somebody else's life. Hey, I think God could work in Bob's life or Tracy's life or Donnie's life. And you know what? You ought to come in expecting God to work in your life. If God's not speaking to you, it's because you're not expecting him to. Because God is not silent. He's shouting out how much he loves you. In fact, you go to the book of Proverbs, you know what it says? That the wisdom, which is an attribute of God, but wisdom is shouting in the marketplace, screaming out to people, screaming out. So if you're not hearing God speak, it's because you're not expecting him to. If we as a church don't see people down the aisle every week, I read this one pastor, first day he started a church, he expected somebody to get saved. 50 of them did. 50 people. It was a brand new opening church. 50 people got saved. Guy came up to him and said, "Preacher, that's awesome, but you don't think this is going to happen every week?" He looked at him and said, "Absolutely I do. Absolutely do." And you know what? Maybe this guy's a liar, but he said every week since he's been serving at that church, someone has gotten saved. Someone's gotten their life changed. And isn't that what we want? Don't we want that? We often want it, but for somebody else. Hey, I want Ben to get his life right, but I don't always want me. Right? I want Randall to get his life right, but I don't always want me. Hey, you know what? If Maple's going to be something for God, you need to walk through the doors and expect God to work in your life. See, those 4 men, they expected God to work through what they did. They said, you know what? Let me be a tool, God. Work through me so that this guy can get the miracle of what you're going to do. And isn't it amazing? God did that. See, the only 4 guys that weren't amazed by the whole thing, they expected it to happen, were the 4 guys that cut the hole in the roof, that lowered their friend down to Jesus. They knew Jesus had the power to do that. Which brings us to our text, really, in Matthew. Matthew chapter 9, a very familiar short passage here. We see 3 examples, 3 lessons that are taught by Jesus about healing or helping the helpless. Not healing the helpless, helping the helpless. Matthew chapter 9, verse 35, it says, Jesus went through, and let me give you a backstory for this. Jesus, in chapter 9 of Matthew, Jesus has raised a girl from the dead. He has stopped a woman who had an issue of blood for 12 years. He has caused a mute to speak. He has caused the blind to see. And for all that, what happened? Well, the Pharisees got together and they said, Jesus, you must be working in league with Satan. You're a son of Beelzebub. That's the only way we can explain it. Good things only happen from demons, don't you know? Where were they thinking? They weren't. And so Jesus moves through, and this is what happens after that. It says Jesus went through all the towns, keyword all, and I should have highlighted that when I underlined and circled it, all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues. What is he teaching? He was teaching, well, it says he was proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. And he's healing every disease and sickness. And I like the fact that he put proclaiming the good news of the kingdom before healing, because what matters more, not the physical, but the spiritual, the long-lasting thing. And so this first lesson that we see here in Matthew chapter 9 is the fact that of the mission. Jesus was always on a mission. I know for week 1 we talked about the mission, but this is what he understood, or the lesson he teaches, that we should always be compelled to share the good news everywhere. That's how we help the helpless. We should always be ready. See, Jesus went to all the towns and villages, and he helped everybody, even the people that had diseases, even the people that were sick with everything. He didn't go, oh, you're sick, COVID, stay away. Jesus embraced the mission. What was the mission? In Mark chapter 10, verse 45, Jesus said, the Son of Man did not come to serve, or to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as ransom for many. That's what Jesus came to do. Jesus understood the mission of God is to serve other people, to love other people, to lift up a paralyzed man to God so that God can change him through the miracle of his power, not ours. See, I can't do anything of my own, but God can. And that's what I should expect from God. He goes on in verse number 36, verse 36 and verse 37 says, when he saw the crowds, this is what he thought. He had compassion on them. He was sad. He was compassionate for them. Why? Because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Sheep are the dumbest animals out there. They really are. And they have no defensive capability. They only have one row of teeth. You know that. They don't have a top and bottom. They only have one row. And so they can't really bite you and hurt you bad. They were harassed and helpless. That's how he would describe sheep without a shepherd, because the shepherd's there to protect. He's there to guide. He's there to lead. He's there to take care of the ailments. These people that Jesus saw as he looks out on society, all the towns, the people who are broken homes and broken hearts and broken lives, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless. And what he was trying to say, he goes on and says, hey, then he said to his disciples, and this is the red letter words, the harvest is plentiful. See, if I looked out and I see people that are harassed and helpless, what I'm thinking is, there's no hope. There's no hope. That's not what Jesus said. Jesus said the harvest is plentiful, and we've heard this before. It's very familiar. Hey, they're everywhere. We can help. The harvest is ready. The harvest is ready. And that's what moves us not past the mission, but to shows us the motive. The motive that we have is that we should always maintain a conviction of compassion for the lost. You see, it didn't get him down when people were at their worst, when people were the sickest. We get the sniffles. We're like, oh, poor me. Can't make it to church. I got the sniffles. Jesus is saying, hey, you don't need to. I'm coming to you. I'm bringing the good news of the kingdom. And he wants his followers, his disciples to know, hey, it's not a no-hope situation. There's a harvest out there, and it's plentiful. You just have to be looking in the right way. You have to have the eyes of God, the vision. We have to have the right motive. And you know what I find? So often we're like the crowd. See, back in Mark chapter 2, and you should have remembered it, the religious guys, what were they doing when Jesus was going about through all this? They were criticizing from their seats. The 4 men who wanted something done, a miracle in somebody else's life, they were lifting, they were increasing the contact. The religious people, they were sitting there thinking bad thoughts. Don't we do that a lot? We sit in our pews and think how evil the world is. Think how, hey, everything's going down the tubes. No hope for the government, no hope for society. And Jesus is saying, hey, look around you. People are struggling. You know what's better? When people are struggling, the harvest is plentiful. When people are hurting, the harvest is plentiful. See, we have the answers. That's what Jesus is really saying. We have the answer. The motive is use compassion. Don't use your own concerns for your well-being. Convince yourself of the compassion of God, that he loves people. See, what Jesus knew that we need to know is that every person you come in contact is a person with a never-dying soul that will spend eternity somewhere. The person you sit across from at work, your friend that you never talk to about church or anything because it might offend them. The waitress at the restaurant that you probably tip lower than you should to. Those are people that Jesus didn't look out and say, they messed up their job, they're irritating, they don't want to hear. Jesus looked at them with compassion, knowing that they were harassed, knowing that they were sick, they were all kinds of problems in them, and he had compassion for them. It continues on in verse number 37, but the workers are few. There's the problem. The workers are few. Jesus' words here, the workers are few. The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. And then he finishes out in verse 38, ask. Now, you've probably heard this before, but ask. He didn't say do, he said ask. Because the doing is not yours. Ask the Lord of the harvest. And I think that's so important. He gives this title. It's the only place you'll find in the Bible that God's given this title, the Lord of the harvest. That means God has the sovereignty of the outcome. See, we often, especially, and I grew up in churches like this, well, you got to go out and knock on doors and win them to the Lord. Hey, I worked for a pastor who used to keep a list of how many people he led to the Lord. Seriously, so he could look at it every once in a while and encourage himself. I'm thinking, I'm not sure. And he even admitted it one time. He was like, I don't know if the list I have is the same list that God has of people who got saved. That's sad, isn't it? You know, the person keeping the real list is God. Let God keep that list. Ask the Lord because he's the one that gives you the increase. Ask the Lord because he said the harvest is ready. Ask the Lord of the harvest. It's all we have to do. Ask the Lord. Therefore, what? Ask him to send out workers. That's the witness, isn't it? We've already seen the weary. We've already seen the worn out. Here's the witness. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. That's our whole idea here. And that brings us to the third point of our three lessons that Jesus is teaching here. The method. We've seen the mission, the motive. Well, here's the method. Never stop praying for the wounded, the weary, and the witness. That's the three things, isn't it? We saw the people who are sick, full of diseases. They're the wounded. The weary, the people that are just tired, and the witness. That's what we're supposed to be praying for. That's the whole idea, which brings us to our whole aim and goal. Red letter living, what's it all about? Red letter living requires prayer and faith in God's purpose. That's what we tell us. Expect God. William Carey said, we should attempt great things for God and expect great things from God. Isn't that amazing? So what is God wanting you to do out of this? Pray more. Maybe increase your faith. You don't increase your faith, though, sitting in a pew. It's active, once again. It's not just in believing, it's in doing. Raise the level of your expectations by doing what God wants. Through prayer, asking the Lord of the harvest to bless us. Maybe it needs to ask God to do something in your heart. Expect good things. Raise the level of your faith to see a miracle in somebody else's. See, if we want to change Seagrove, Asheboro, Randolph County, and all the counties around us, and North Carolina, and the whole nation, it's not about picketing. It's not about protesting our government. It's not even voting correctly and putting Christians in office. None of those things are going to change the world. I know that's disappointing. None of those things are going to change the world. You know what's going to change the world? By raising the level of our faith to see the miracle in somebody else's life through prayer and faith in God's purpose.